Good afternoon. Welcome to the second class on the origins and future of unions. Dr. Michael Goldfield earned his BA in philosophy from Williams College, an MA in both philosophy and political science, as well as his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. He was assistant professor in the government department at Cornell University and professor of industrial relations and human resources in the Department of Political Science at Wayne State University from 1992 to 2018. Currently, Dr. Goldfield is Professor Emeritus of Political Science and a research fellow at the Fraser Center for the Study of Workplace Issues at Wayne State University. And he also, right now, is an affiliate faculty member at the University of Washington in the Harry Bridges Labor Center. Dr. Goldfield is a former labor activist and the author of numerous articles and books on race and labor, including The Decline of Organized Labor in the US, The Color of Politics, Race, and the Mainsprings of American Politics, and most recently, The Southern Key, Class, Race, and Radicalism in the 1930s and 1940s. Please welcome Dr. Michael Goldfield from Seattle, Washington.
Hello, everybody. Nice to be here. I've tried to incorporate a number of questions into my presentation, but feel free to interrupt me as we go along. So we're going to talk a little bit about the post-World War II labor movement and also some questions, things about what's going on today. I'm going to try to run early enough so that we have time for questions. So if we look at this chart, which I had up there last time, you can see that pretty much since 1945, with a peak in 1953, the percentage of workers in unions has declined. This chart just goes to 2012. The total figure is a little below 6% now. The total figure, can you see the arrow that I have on the chart?
Your slides are not advancing.
Michael, I need you to go to the next slide. You're still on the first one. We're still seeing the first.
Okay, hold on one second.
And you're not in slide view either, so we're seeing all of the editing stuff around the edges.
You want to go to the top left-hand corner where it says play from start?
Yeah, I already did that. That's what's showing on my, let's try this again.
Oops.
So this is the first slide. Can you see the second now?
No, not yet.
Maybe you need to stop it and then reshare your screen. It looks almost like we got stuck on a different screen than the actual one you see.
Yeah. Okay, let me stop share and reshare.
Okay.
Let's see.
Yeah, you want to keep your PowerPoint open, but then click on share screen and select.
Yeah, I already did that. So
okay.
I'm going to
there it is.
Oh, yay!
Looks good.
Okay, you got that?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, so you can look at this, and I'm going to go to the next screen where I talk about some of the highlights. So the high points are that in 1945 and 1953, there were 35 to 36% of the labor force organized into unions. I calculate roughly 43, 44% in the private sector. The public sector had at most 5 to 10%, depending on local, state, or federal levels. West Virginia, the most unionized state at that time, had over 50% unionization. At one point, There were well over 100,000 unionized coal miners in West Virginia. Michigan had over 40% unionization. Today, Michigan, which is the third highest state after Hawaii and New York, has 18.5% unionization. And some of the decline in unions in the total figures is masked by the incredible growth in the public sector. So at the local, state, and federal levels in the 1960s and 1970s, unionization went from 5 or 10% to 35 to 40%, where it remains today. And the reason these figures are all approximation, because there's all sorts of funny calculations about who you count as an eligible member, who's a supervisor, who isn't not. And if you look at the Starbucks organizing, the shift supervisors are eligible because they don't have ability to hire and fire, which is the legal definition of what puts people in management. And so there's lots of other quirks that make any exact figure not really that accurate. So one of the things people asked was what happened to Detroit? In 1945, 95% of the automobiles were produced in the United States, the majority of them in Michigan, in Southeast Michigan, in the Detroit area. In 1945, there were almost 400,000 auto workers in Detroit. Since the 1980s, there's less than 10,000. From 1945 on, until recently, there were no new plants built in the Detroit area. So this is a picture of Dodge, Maine, in Hamtramck, which is, for people who don't know, is actually inside a community inside Detroit, but a separate community. And the plant at this time had 20,000 employees, excuse me. And so auto plants leave Detroit, and there was a question about this. Why did this happen? Well, firstly, GM and Ford, which were the most profitable automakers, decentralized their production nationally. So they moved most of their plants away from Michigan and put their assembly plants near places where they could sell their cars. Chrysler did not do that as quickly. They were less profitable, so they kept most of their production in the 60s still in the Detroit area. Secondly, what happened is the auto companies started outsourcing their parts to places with cheaper labor, and the unionization of parts production has gone to very low levels. Michigan still leads in parts production, but the South, places in the South, particularly Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, are expanding greatly. The other thing that happened, and this was the main rationale, is that if we can go back, if you look at the Hamtramck plant, these auto plants were all multi-story plants, some of them 6 stories high. Auto production changed. They wanted 1 story, and they moved to what they call greenfield construction, meaning outside Detroit was pretty much the boonies after the war. And so they could get land cheaply and build new construction the way they wanted. Another aspect for leaving Detroit is that they seem to be leaving unions behind. And at least some of the plants wanted to get away from the African-American workforce, which happened temporarily, but African-Americans moved eventually out to these plants outside Detroit. So the Detroit area, not the city itself, still has a lot of auto production. There are places in Macomb County where you can drive for several miles and all you see are auto plants. And I have people tell me, oh, auto left Michigan. No, that's not true. You can see dozens of plants in the Detroit area. The other thing people asked about automation. So automation has played a role, an important role, some of it positive. So when I worked in a plant, the paint shops were done manually. People were dying of lung cancer and all sorts of terrible lung diseases. So by the 80s, paint shops were all automated. A lot of the welding is automated. So right now, automobile companies produce probably the same amount of cars with a quarter of the labor that they used to produce. The other thing that's happened, while the number of cars produced in North America, and a lot of the figures are combined, US and Canada. I mean, if you live in Detroit, you can see things go back and forth from Windsor and their auto production, the Windsor area. So there are now between, or I say now, but certainly before the pandemic, there were 90 to 100 million vehicles produced each year, 15, 16, 18 million of them in North America, whereas previously 95% of them were produced in. So things have decentralized not only around the country, but globally. China, the last figures I saw, is producing more automobiles than the US is. The additional thing that's happened in the US is transplants. Transplants mean foreign companies that have put their production facilities in the US, and mostly this is the big four Japanese companies, starting with Toyota, Mitsubishi, Honda, et cetera. And 25% of auto production in the US is done by transplants. The transplants have tended to be built in the South, not in the North, certainly not in Michigan. Although interestingly, for research purposes, Southeast Michigan is still the center of world research on automobiles. So Wayne State, Michigan State, University of Michigan are really where the most advanced auto research takes place. Even Toyota has a huge research facility in Southeast Michigan. Ann Arbor supposedly has the most extensive testing area for non-driver vehicles. So the auto plants left Detroit for a variety of reasons. And somebody asked if the unions played some role, but even when the big three have put plants other places, they've usually been, particularly in the North, quickly unionized. So the classic example is Lordstown, Ohio. They put the Lordstown plant in a rural area that was all white. They had the production and the speed of the line faster than any other place in the world. And within a year or two, there were wildcats and walkouts and protests about speed and everything else. So the other question is, in terms of unions, globalization and the capitalist offensive. So let's start with globalization. There's definitely been a decline of industrial production in the United States. So more than half of the industrial workers in the world today reside in China. We have 12, 15 million. There's probably 200 million in China. But in fact, the biggest declines in unions have taken place in what I would call the landlocked industries. In other words, industries that cannot go abroad and move globally. So construction, there's 10 or 12 million construction workers, depending on who you count. Construction workers used to be almost completely unionized. Construction tends to be a local industry. Unionization takes place in urban areas where most of the construction takes place, or along highways. Starting in the 60s, there was a concerted attack by corporate users of construction labor to break the unions, and they've greatly decreased unionization. Trucking is another industry that was almost completely unionized. Trucking is not something that can that can go to some other country. There's 4 to 5 million truckers. And trucking is a complicated industry also because there are truckers who work for grocery stores delivering things. So it's not just people who work for trucking companies. But with deregulation, trucking was almost completely deunionized as competition developed in a way that destroyed certainly most of the road unions. Airline workers, while most of them did not deunionize, wages and pensions and everything dropped. And that was certainly true in the biggest airline located in Michigan, which was Northwest and ended up being consolidated with Delta. Coal mining, partly there are global things, but in the United States, basically coal ran out. And then to the extent that it didn't run out, coal has been priced out of the market. So at one point, and also automation took place greatly in the coal industry. So up until the end of World War II, there were 500,000 or 600,000 coal miners in the country. Today, there's way less than 50,000, maybe 30,000. And coal is likely to disappear because it's much more expensive these days than using natural gas, and may end up even, it's probably even more expensive than solar or wind energy. The capitalist offensive, and let me also mention, there are some other big industries in the country with lots of employees. They're also landlocked that are not heavily unionized. The biggest one is the healthcare industry. I don't know what the data is today. I mean, there's been a lot of people quitting, but before the pandemic, there were well over 20 million healthcare workers. Nurses tend to be more unionized, but other categories in the healthcare industry have not been unionized. That's an industry that also has very little to do with globalization. While there's some ability to move healthcare facilities offshore, basically, as we know, it all takes place in the country, right? Okay, the other important thing to know is the increase in the capitalist offensive. I trace this in a fair amount of detail in my book, The Decline of Organized Labor, but also a number of subsequent articles. The increase in firing people illegally firing people during union organizing campaigns. So in Memphis, Starbucks fired 7 union activists and claimed it was for something else. And when we say illegal firings, there are lots of people who get fired who don't keep the records and can't prove that they were fired for union activity. So the data that we have shows people who the National Labor Relations Board determined were illegally fired and how to be brought to work. So to take 1 year, 1980, 70,000 workers voted for unions at elections. There were 10,000 illegal firings. That means if you voted for a union, you had a 1 in 7 chance of being fired. If you were a union activist, you probably had more than a 50% chance of being fired. So one of the reasons for the decline of unions has to be with how aggressive major corporations have been. And we don't see any real let up in that. The current union campaigns, which are being publicized, show quite a bit of anti-union activity. There's also a $1 billion industry of anti-union firms, some of which use legal things, some of which advise, and some of which use fairly violent means. There was a recent strike in the Seattle area that's still going on of cement workers, and the National Labor Relations Board determined that the company purposely sent scab trucks to run over pickets. So what happened in Detroit? Well, interestingly, Detroit used to be one of the most affluent cities in the country. The percentage of home ownership in the city in the 1950s and the 1960s was higher than any other urban area. The percentage of Black home ownership was higher. And so most of Detroit, with its large percentage of home ownership, looked to a certain extent like suburban areas, nicely trimmed lawns, nicely kept up houses and whatnot. So people ask me, what happened to Detroit? Was it the riots? Was it Coleman Young? And I say, no, those things are really so secondary. Detroit was a one-horse town. It had one industry. I mean, it had other industries, but basically it had one major industry, the auto industry. It was a one-horse town. The horse left. That's the end of the story. The question some people have asked is, will Detroit come back? So, I mean, I lived and worked in Detroit for 30 years. I got there. The downtown was run down. The area around Wayne State is run down. Things look very different these days. The whole waterfront has been built up and is nice to walk along. Downtown is filled with restaurants and coffee shops and the whole bit. And the area around Wayne State that had a few greasy spoons and whatnot now has dozens, if not hundreds, of restaurants and shops. We have 3 billionaires who've invested huge amounts of money. You may hear about it in the news in Western Michigan, but the Ilitch family, Roger Penske, Dan Gilbert, who owns Quicken Loans, they've put a lot of money. And if you look in the whole area, east and west of the downtown, there's tens of thousands of condos and new housing and whatnot. But none of this replaces yet the auto industry. So it's hard to know whether, to what extent Detroit is coming back. And there are cities that have rebuilt themselves. Pittsburgh is certainly one. Somebody mentioned Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh has become a center for medical research and hospitals and whatnot, and that's more or less replaced the steel industry that disappeared from the Pittsburgh area. Buffalo is partly back, and it's become a center for trade with Canada, being right on the border. I don't see any major industry yet that's sufficiently large to replace the auto industry in Detroit. But I don't have any strong opinion on that, so we'll see. We'll have to see what happens. Okay, so what's been going on recently? There's a well, why don't I stop now? Are there more questions or things that I haven't dealt with? I didn't fully understand all the questions on the list that I was given last time. So
There aren't any new questions that have popped up, so you can go on and
okay, so the current period is interesting. There's certainly much more labor activity than there has been in a while. Whether it's sufficient to be a whole new wave that leads to more unionization is yet to be seen. But the early indications have been the large number of teacher strikes. So there's always been a lot of strikes, but some of these are big. And the interesting thing is that budgets in general state budgets have been cut much more extensively in Republican controlled states than in Democratic states. And teachers' salaries and funding for schools have taken a big hit. So with the exception of Chicago, in the 2018, 2019 period, the biggest wave of strikes took place in Republican states. So West Virginia, which in 2016 had the highest percentage of vote for Republicans and Donald Trump, had enormous teachers' strike, with many of the teachers saying that they were children or grandchildren of union coal miners, and they were looking to that tradition. So they had marches of thousands upon thousands of people. Chicago, like Detroit, is not unexpected. And in Oklahoma, where the budget cuts had been more severe than virtually any state in the country, this is a picture of 3,000 teachers who occupied the state capitol, demanding that lawmakers increase teachers' budgets. Currently, there are a number of strikes going on. The biggest one is taking place in Minneapolis. And there's some type of settlement. We'll see whether the teachers vote to approve it. The other thing that's going on is that unionized workers, including teachers, have been rejecting settlements that their leaders have brokered. So in terms of evaluating what's going on now, we have to look at the type of leverage that various workers have. So I think the biggest thing in the news these days are the number of Starbucks workers who are organizing. And the interesting thing is, as I mentioned last time, workers at Starbucks have very little what I call structural power. Structural power is the leverage that workers possess given their relationship to the economics system. Are they replaceable? And how much bargaining power and influence on the economy do they have? So here's a picture of coal miners. If coal miners strike, particularly when they struck when coal was the preeminent fuel in the country, people for heating, railroads and everything else would run out of fuel. They're difficult to replace. Nobody in their right mind who's not trained as a coal miner and working with trained coal miners goes down in a coal mine, right? None of us would do that sort of thing. When coal miners struck during World War II, they had big signs that said, "You can't mine coal with bayonets." So when the army was called out to take over coal mines, coal miners said, "Lots of luck." Starbucks workers can probably be easily replaced. The other type of power that workers have, I suggest, is associational power, that they may not have leverage, but they're able to give more symbolic support. So I would distinguish what's happening with Starbucks with what we see happening at Amazon. So retail workers are organizing. Well, let me go, let's see. No, I'll go back. So especially important today is the logistic industry and the whole logistic chain. What does that involve? So that's how goods get from where they're produced all around the world in this global economy to consumers. Some of it by mail, some of it in big box stores. So this starts probably I should have something up here with the production of things all over the world. Things are put into ships. They're put into containers. There's currently a shortage of containers with the pandemic. Much of the shipping, a certain amount of the shipping was mothballed, and containers were not produced. Shipping and demand for containers increased more than it had in the pre-pandemic period. So there's a shortage of ships, there's a shortage of containers. These containers are unloaded in the United States, but around the world by dock workers and people doing dock work. People are sometimes working in close quarters. Many of them have gotten sick during the pandemic. The unions tend to be strong, and they've demanded better protection and whatnot. From the docks, the containers are loaded onto trucks, and then they go to warehouses. So this is where Amazon fits in. Although Amazon also has its own trucks, they have their own airport with airplanes. And important of all, they have 28 data centers for coordinating all this. And Amazon is sharply distinguished from Walmart, which has been another highly anti-union firm. So Walmart is the biggest employer in the country, has perhaps as many as 2 million employees, but 95% of them are in stores. Walmart has 4,000 stores, averaging 400 or 500 people apiece. Individual stores are like this are hard to organize. Amazon is just the opposite. At least 80% of Amazon's over 1 million workers work in warehouses, fulfillment centers, delivery centers. So these are people in highly automated situations. They're also now increasingly hiring local delivery people. So this is a picture of Amazon's, on the left, Amazon's headquarters in Seattle. They have as many as 50, 60, 70,000 employees, most technical white-collar workers in Seattle itself, helping create a huge housing crisis because people want to live closer to work. So here's a picture of a fulfillment center. So the conditions that the people at the headquarters are somewhat different. And I've got a blown up picture here. So these are all individual workstations. Anybody here not get things from Amazon? Probably not, right? So how do you get next day delivery or even same day delivery? You have people at all these different workstations. 6,000 people are employed in this one Staten Island fulfillment center. And this isn't even the delivery warehouse. They're working at breakneck speed. Every movement is monitored. One of the complaints that this warehouse or fulfillment center has a union drive going on. People can, if you look here, you don't see any bathrooms nearby. People were complaining, workers were complaining that the nearest bathrooms were 10 minutes away and they were given 5 minutes for a bathroom, 2 bathroom breaks a day. There were pictures of people with plastic bottles so they wouldn't have to go to the bathroom, look for a bathroom during their break. And these pictures were posted on social media. So, and the speed and the pressure which these people have all had to work by their account, in any case, to get things delivered to us by the next day Sounds from the description pretty draconian. I've talked to Amazon workers at some of these warehouses and fulfillment centers, and it doesn't sound pleasant. Amazon's strategy was been to mostly hire young people, expecting them to be burned out within 6 months and replaced. So that's one business model, right? There are other business models. Costco, for example, pays more and has a much higher retention rate. So Amazon workers have a lot of leverage. If they were to go on strike, lots of things, essential parts of the economy wouldn't happen. A lot of us wouldn't get things that we wanted or needed. So Amazon workers in these fulfillment centers and delivery centers have a fair amount of structural leverage. Starbucks workers have very little, but the interesting thing, in general, when a huge amount of union growth has taken place, it usually starts with people who have more structural leverage. So in the 1930s, coal miners led the way, auto workers led the way, retail workers, as I suggested last time, followed. In this period, we see there's a picture from a place in Seattle where Starbucks workers just unionized. In this particular, this I think is one of their original signature coffee shops, and every single worker at this place voted for the union. So it was 100%. So we can suspect that the grievances were relatively deeply felt. But we also have unionization taking place, all sorts of other, I don't want to say strange, but places that you wouldn't expect to be in the vanguard, right? So people familiar with Conde Nast, which is one of the big magazine publishing companies. They own Vogue, Vanity Fair, GQ, Wired, New Yorker. Hopefully, I don't know, I'm assuming these names mean something to most people, and quite a few other publications. So the workers at Conde Nast all just voted to unionize. So 500 of them at their central headquarters who weren't already unionized. The ones at the Wired New Yorker had already been unionized, but 500 more voted to unionize. And there's lots of other workers unionizing. Future prospects. So the number of people, and I want to suggest that this is taking place all over the country and in a huge range of industries. So Etsy sellers are going on strike. They want customers to boycott a 30% increase in fees. Baristas, it's hard to know what's driving. So in the Detroit area, Great Lakes Roasting is one of these high-end coffee shops, very expensive. There's one right by Wayne where people from the Detroit Medical Center go. All these places are on strike. So we see, not just in Boston or Detroit, but Missoula, Montana. Everybody know where Missoula, Montana is? Probably not. So they're forming a union. Workers at the East Columbia Basin Irrigation District in Othello, Washington, went on a sick-out strike. As I mentioned, there are cement workers on strike in the area here. So this seems to be taking place, and the industrial workers or the more traditional workers are almost unreported in the media. There have been 1,100, 1,200 coal miners in Alabama who've been on strike for a few months. You don't read about that in the media. Some of the strikes we read about when Frito-Lay potato chips workers went on strike, or cookie workers went on strike. But mostly you don't hear about the traditional workers. I think that for some reason, people who work in coffee shops or at Amazon is somehow more newsworthy, sexier or something than traditional workers. So what's going to happen? It's hard to know. So one of the questions that was on the list was, have unions passed their time, past their usefulness? Well, as I've indicated in the first session that we have, union membership and union activity and strikes tend to go in huge cycles and huge drops. Predictions about these things are dangerous to make. So at the end of my book, The Decline of Organized Labor, I quote the top labor economists in the country in 1933 saying that unions have outlived their usefulness and are a thing of the past. And that was a bad year to make such a prediction, because as I suggested from the data last time, union membership from 1933 to 1945 went up to from 3 million to 15 million. There's no surety that an increase is going to take place today, but certainly there's lots of activity. Part of it is spurred by the tight labor market. Workers have a lot of leverage. We've all read about the Great Resignation. Millions of workers each month have been quitting their jobs. Employers are having trouble hiring people. Ramping up hiring has taken place so rapidly from the low levels particularly before vaccination was widespread, that many employers, and I assume this is taking place in Western Michigan also, right? There's a lot of shortages of workers in places, even restaurants, coffee shops, production facilities, and there are different reasons for all these things. Healthcare workers, there are shortages of, and partly they've been burned out during the pandemic. They've been overwhelmed, and for some reason that I fail to understand, one can read this, but I've talked to a lot of healthcare workers, and patients, some percentage of patients treat them pretty horribly. I've talked to workers at the University of Washington Hospital who tell me that when some patients come in and are diagnosed with COVID, they start screaming at the healthcare workers and telling them that they're lying, et cetera. They want ivermectin, the horse tranquilizer. And when they won't get it, they throw fits at people. And I've known people, including one of my family members, who've gotten PTSD taking care of people, which strikes me as pretty bad. Any case, I'm hoping that we have questions. I've tried to make this shorter because there were a lot of unanswered questions from last time. And let me know what you have, Helen.
Okay, great, Michael. Two questions that came in sort of just after you stepped back and started talking more nationally related to Detroit and Michigan. One, I grew up in Detroit, and I would agree in part the auto industry was part of the reason for decline. However, white flight was a primary mover. Whole neighborhoods changed over in a couple of years. The decline of mass transit, loss of light rail, and the increase in freeways, which cut up ethnic neighborhoods, were part of the result of that as well. So can you comment on that?
Sure. So the auto industry was leaving Detroit by 1945. Well, the riots took place in 67, and new plants were being built in Macomb County, outlying places in other counties, including Wayne outside Detroit, in the late 40s and in the 50s. So most of the so-called white flight took place before the riots took place. And so I think it's a mistake to attribute, and the jobs were there. These communities were totally inhospitable to African Americans moving into them where the plants were built. And so whites moved into these areas. The other thing that happened, the federal government's mortgage policy made it very difficult. It was easy to get loans for new construction outside Detroit. Even for white people within Detroit, it was very difficult to get loans to refurbish or to upgrade existing housing. It was much cheaper to move from the city. So I think the people who put the onus on the riots, one, have the dates wrong and do not look at the other factors that took place. So the FHA and the VHA tended to be controlled by people, many of them, but not all of them, from the South, who were fairly openly racist. And the ability to get a loan or get a mortgage, not just in a Black neighborhood, but in a mixed neighborhood, was very minimal. And this was before 1967. This was in the 50s and the early 60s. So I think these are the biggest factors, and the 67 events are somewhat secondary, although the popular imagination and the media attribute the white flight to that. And we can also tell this from population figures. So Detroit had in the early 50s had close to 2 million people. The population was dropping immensely throughout the 50s and throughout the early part of the 60s. And these were mostly whites going to areas where new construction was taking place.
Okay, another question. Can Dr. Goldfield comment on the fact that Michigan became a right to work in recent years? How unexpected how unexpected is this in what was formerly a very union state?
Yeah, so I think what happened, the UAW, how can I say this, became very cautious and unwilling to be aggressive in terms of doing things or struggling for its members. And I think this is reflected in the tepidness of their union organizing campaigns in places in the South. So their campaign at Toyota in Tennessee was very ineffective. And that's in contrast to construction unions themselves not particularly radical, but much more aggressive, that actually unionized the construction workers building the Toyota plant and won unionized labor for construction and skilled trades within the plant. The UAW didn't do a good job in Mississippi and lost pretty badly there. So I think that's reflected in the fact that they were so cautious. They thought they could negotiate a deal where the right to work did not develop. They didn't mobilize their membership and support to oppose it. They try to work through back channels. So this was even reflected, their cautiousness was also reflected, for example, during the newspaper strike. So I was struck 20 years ago that when the newspaper strike took place, you could go almost all over Michigan and see signs in support of the striking newspaper workers. You could go to Flint, you could go to East Lansing, all around the state, there were signs supporting the newspaper workers' strike. The UAW did very little at that time to mobilize its membership in support of the strike. So I think that their cautiousness and their willingness to accept on faith what they were told by Republicans was a bad tactical move. So, and I think part of what's happened to the UAW, they at one point had 1.5 million members. They have now 300,000 to 400,000 members. They've totally declined as a union. And I would contrast them even with the Teamsters, which have been much more aggressive. Teamsters often don't get a good rep, much more aggressive in organizing. And I think the Teamsters still have, I don't know, 1.4 million members when I looked last. So they may have lost a couple 100,000 members in the past decades, but nowhere near the losses that the UAW has faced.
Okay. Considering that the difficult conditions and shortages facing healthcare workers, why do you think that there has not been more aggressive organizing activity? Is this just a lag, or are there other reasons that healthcare workers are not being aggressively organized?
I think that there will be more organizing of healthcare workers. So, for example, nurses are fairly well organized nationally, and certainly in the Midwest and the North and the Northeast. Nurses are in a position where there's a shortage of nurses, high demand. Other categories of healthcare workers have not been organized, and at least before the pandemic, many of them were easily replaceable, or they at least seem to be easily replaceable. I think that the conditions that healthcare workers have faced during the pandemic are going to lead to more organizing of healthcare workers. In certain parts of the healthcare, so a lot of the healthcare industry has been taken over by big conglomerates. That's not totally the case in Michigan, where, I don't know, does Henry Ford stretch out to your part of the state?
No.
Not as much. I mean, I think halfway across the state is where their outreach is. But in any case, many of the, and this is true particularly of senior centers, where the conditions we found, if you didn't know it beforehand, during the pandemic have been so terrible for seniors. These have been minimum wage, mostly immigrant labor jobs situations that are difficult to unionize and huge companies owning them that are going to put resources into keeping them from being organized. But I think that the pandemic has brought out a lot of anger among healthcare workers. So I have a granddaughter who was an ICU nurse in Brooklyn at one of those places that was hit initially. And she didn't have any PPE for the first 3 or 4 weeks, and almost all her colleagues got COVID, some of them being very sick. And the hospital itself wasn't in a big hurry to take care of people. And I think these type of things, which are fairly universal, have got people upset and more open to unionizing. The other interesting thing is that doctors in some places have started to unionize. 10, 20 years ago, this would have been unheard of to think of doctors unionizing. But I think the big healthcare systems, many of them have put doctors on piecework, 7 minutes to examine a patient for this sort of thing, 9 minutes for this. Some meds we cover, some meds we don't. We've all run into this, right? I mean, unless you have really good healthcare and pharmaceutical coverage, that you find something gets prescribed, maybe it's $10, and then another thing that's similar, they say, oh, you'd have to pay for this out of your pocket, it's $2,000. And I mean, I've had this happen to me, but there's a lot of quirks because of the consolidation of the healthcare industry. I mean, the other thing we see, which presumably we don't see in Michigan, is that in one of the things these conglomerates have done is get rid of rural hospitals because rural healthcare facilities are not that profitable. So in much of the South, in rural areas, people don't have a hospital within an hour of them. So I think this consolidation will likely, and there's no predicting, lead to more unionization among healthcare workers as they find their situations less favorable.
Okay, why do you think public employee unions have grown while private sector unions have declined?
So there's a couple reasons for that. So the growth of public sector unions in the late 50s and early 60s partly was a result of greater leverage. So many parts of the public sector expanded immensely after World War II. So school systems grew quite a bit. New York, the biggest school system, went from, I don't know, 15, 20,000 teachers to 50,000 teachers. The administrative units were bigger. People had more leverage and power. In the federal government, the same thing took place. And it's also an illusion. Every presidential administration, Democrat or Republican, since Reagan, claims that they've shrunk the size of the federal government. But in reality, every single administration has expanded it by outsourcing and privatizing various functions. So things have gotten bigger. And once the explosion took place, and I would argue that the New York City teachers' strike was the key stimulating factor in 1960, 1961 for teachers organizing. So there's several million public school teachers in the country. Before 1960, you had 2 limping chapters of the American Federation of Teachers, one in New York, one in Chicago. Within a few months after the New York City teachers strike, every large city in the country, including Detroit, had a thriving American Federation of Teachers chapter and a union. The other thing that's happened is it is more difficult for governments, the public sector, to use the type of anti-union tactics that private sector employees have been able to use. So, you can't use these factors, or you can't use these tactics without getting into trouble politically. If you start hiring thugs to beat organizers up and this comes out, politicians are in trouble. So they've had to use much softer tactics to oppose unions, and the union wave swept the public sector so quickly and so universally. I mean, particularly in the Midwest and the Northeast and the West Coast, where the unionization was almost universal. So I think that this has been a big factor. The other thing is certain industries are hidden from the public. Everybody knows a postal worker, perhaps, or sees their postal workers. Parents see their school teacher. So these are not people who are hidden from view, and they're people who most people have some personal relationship with. And when they express their demands, there's lots of sympathy for them. So I think that these are important factors that have led to both the takeoff and the staying power of public sector unions.
Okay, this is more a comment. The big unionization growth spurts in the past were, in a sense, a worker versus management company conflict driven, that kind of environment. Current health workers do not necessarily see hospitals or management as the enemy, as wages have increased much faster than some other sectors. So just might want to comment on that.
So only certain types of wages have increased. So actually, physicians' wages have decreased. I mean, when they've been taken over by these big conglomerates. And I'm not saying we should cry for them, but if people's wages go down from $200,000 to $175,000 a year, or whatever the exact figures are, depending on the healthcare system, the nurses' wages have gone up significantly, particularly nurses in specialties like anesthesia and cardiac care and whatnot. But other healthcare workers, orderly people in food and whatnot, have not gone up significantly. So it's very uneven what's happened to healthcare workers. And I think that, particularly given the pandemic, people evaluate whether it's worth it for the type of exposure and unsafe conditions that they're working in.
Yeah. Okay, there's some questions from last time here. Are there examples of large organizations that do it right and either have a good working relationship with unions or have learned to work harmoniously enough with labor that unions are not necessary? I'm thinking NUMMI.
No, I think NUMMI ran into all sorts of trouble. There are certainly places where there are more congenial relations with unions that companies have, but there are also certain inherent conflicts, right? So most companies are there to make money and make profits, expand their production, get greater markets, get more work out of their employees, and whatnot. Workers don't want to be worked to death. They want to be paid adequately, perhaps more. They want to be in conditions where they're able to live some type of harmonious life without being totally exhausted when they get home, without dying soon after they stop work, before they can enjoy a retirement. And I think some of those conflicts, certainly with companies, are fairly inherent in the work-employer situation. So while there's certainly a range of companies in terms of how they deal with unions and how conflictual the relationship is, there's also been some argument with big investors in Starbucks that they're mad at the management for taking such an aggressive anti-union position. So one hedge fund, which has significant investment, says that Starbucks is wasting too much money fighting unions, and they should accept the unions and find a way to get along with them. So, I'm not saying that this is a simple question, but the more successful and aggressive the unions are, the more incentive there is for companies to make some type of accommodation. And as I've mentioned previously, because someone asked this question, union workplaces are much more productive than non-union workplaces. And there is a trade-off, because union workplaces also pay more than non-union workplaces. But if you want a stable, productive workforce, then there's some interest on the part of the company at trying to reach an accommodation with them. And there's been comparisons between, in the literature, of Walmart and Costco, which have very different approaches to how they try to deal with workers and unions.
Okay, this is a question from last time. During the early 2000s, the percentage of people that were unionized was 19%. At the same time, the middle class was 19% of the population. What kind of effect has the drop in union membership had on the middle class?
Well, if we look at the figures that I've mentioned, unionized workers make more money, have better health care coverage, have better retirement packages. So, and in general, there's a much greater disparity between the lowest paid and the highest paid workers in non-unionized facilities. So many people have cited, I think correctly, the fact that the decline in unions has contributed to the greater income inequality in the country. So this is a big popular type of issue, right? We've had the rise in the percentage of wealth, not just a couple mega billionaires like Jeff Bezos and others, but in general, that the top 1% has an increasingly large percentage of the wealth of the country, and the people in the bottom 90% or so have a much lower percentage of wealth. And I think that the decline in unions has had an impact on that in two ways. One is that unionized people make more, but the other is the ability to challenge or combat policies that greatly favor the rich decline as unions decline, because they're one of the few groups that has an interest and has, if they're well organized, enough strength to challenge these type of policies. So I think that deunionization has been a big contributor to growing income and wealth inequality in the country.
It certainly is interesting that those percentages are the same, that's for sure. Okay, with respect to globalization, have higher union wages spurred companies to ship production offshore?
Well, I think that whatever the wages are in this country, they're greater. The disparities are great. So there's different type of things that have been shifted offshore, and there's different places they can go. For example, for certain types of production, offshore has to be near shore. So if you want parts for certain types of things in the auto industry, and you want them just in time and you need them immediately, Mexico is much more desirable and much more immediate than having them in some other part of the world. On the other hand, if you want clothing, which there's no rush for, and you can do with very low skilled labor. So textile and clothing production are very unskilled work. And they also take small amounts of capital to get going. If you want to set up a big auto plant like in Mexico, you may spend $1 billion or a couple $2 billion. If you want to set up a textile production facility, it's a tiny fraction of that. And you can train textile workers often in 6 weeks to be fully productive. So that's why textile production, if we look at the course of World War II, first it moved to Japan, then it moved to places like Taiwan, then to China. And even as wages have gone up in China, China gets priced out of the market, and we have things in Thailand, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Vietnam, etc. So these things are all challenges, and some people argue that US foreign policy has kept these countries from developing and wages from rising. So one counterexample we can see, for example, South Korea, which started out as a low-wage country. They developed their education system. They got a lot of investments. They were a textile center in the 70s and early 80s, and then became a center for steel. By the mid-1980s, they had the most efficient steel production in the world. And as we know, South Korea produces not just steel, but cars and other fairly sophisticated machinery. And their wages have gone up, not completely, but nearer to those of in this country.
Interesting. Okay, another question. I know for a fact that a journeyman electrician makes $8 an hour less in the West Michigan compared to the east side of Michigan. Can you comment on that?
So construction wages tend to have to do with local markets. So one of the things that private companies didn't like is that governments that used construction labor had to pay prevailing wages, and prevailing wages tended to be unionized wages. The apprenticeships and journeymen tend to be controlled in many places by the union. So certain urban areas, the pay scales are higher. I haven't looked at the exact figures, so I'm taking the word of the person who did this, that the wages are higher in the east side of the state than the west. But the east side of the state has been traditionally the most unionized part of the state. So it stands to reason that unionized labor would be higher. And but construction tends to be in local markets. It's a region that historically construction unions have not been that interested in national political developments, whereas government workers, particularly federal workers, but also unions that were national in scope, tend to be much more interested in national politics. So construction labor and electrician labor are local. While people can move, electricians tend to stay put. So the competition from one side of the state to the other isn't as extreme as it is in other industries.
Okay, another question just came in here. What changes do you think should be made in how the NLRB functions?
So that's an interesting question. The NLRB started out as a very pro-labor institution, and it's had its wings clipped periodically, both by legislation, but also by the Supreme Court. So, but my analysis is that union growth has taken place not because of laws or how these institutions function, but that their functioning tends to follow the growth or the decline of the labor movement. So I don't see changes in labor law as the major facilitator of what would help unions. If we look at the period from 1933 to 1937, unions grew tremendously in spite of very anti-labor laws and legal decisions. Certainly, it would be helpful if some of the things in the PRO Act, the pro-union legislation that's being put forward in Congress help, but I don't see that as the major facilitator of growth.
Okay, there's another question, but I've sort of directed it back to the original asker because he knows more about this than anything. So this is John Crawford. John, who's sitting right next to Carol, do you want to just sort of read that question and ask it of Michael? I think you'll do a better job of it than I would.
Just a second. Oops, what did I do? There we go.
I don't see it.
Oh, your question? Okay, just a second, Helen. Chat.
Got to get a little lower, John. We've just see the
Okay.
bottom of your face. Okay, that's better.
Okay, currently it takes 4 years to become a journeyman woman in a trade. Welder is a trade, machinist is a trade, carpenter is a trade, and pipe fitter is a trade, among others. Yet in the auto industry, and possibly other factories as well, an individual in the mechanical trade is expected to perform all these skills as if they were trained in a single apprenticeship of 4 years. I know for a fact that there are more than 400 individual tasks that a journeyman woman millwright has to master. How can the current practice be justified? So instead of one trade, which takes 4 years to master, they're supposed to master 4 trades or more in 4 years. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, John, and I think it's also complicated. So ever since I got initially involved in the labor movement in the 70s, people would debate whether some of the skilled trades actually required as much training. So how long did it really take you to become a tool maker, a good tool maker, or a good millwright? Is the 4 years there just as a bar to keep people from being a journeyman, or is that all that training really necessary? And I think there's clearly, as you suggest, a big variance. So when a new auto plant, or in the case I worked for International Harvester, a new construction equipment plant opens, it often takes year and a half to get up to full production. Why is that the case? Because it's not just engineering problems, but getting people up to speed on the necessary skills often requires a good deal of time and coordination. So how long it actually takes to learn an electrical or a plumber's trade or a millwright's trade, I think is debatable. I've heard of people hired into non-union shops as a tool maker who within a few months were up to speed. So I guess what I'm saying, there's no easy answer to your question. Clearly, there are big disparities in what the type of training that people get. I would say the same thing as for academics, right? So if one's a ski instructor, one often has to go through months of training before they let you loose on a customer. If you're an academic, you get your PhD and they throw you into a classroom and there's no training whatsoever. And some people develop as good teachers and others don't. So I think that the problem that you're looking at is sort of typical across. I mean, and I mentioned the teaching because that's such a different type of profession than than being a skilled tradesperson. So I think those disparities exist all over, and there's not necessarily rhyme or reason to them.
Okay.
Hey, there was one more comment from last time that if you can just comment on it. It seems, and this is what it said, it seems to me that Amazon will indeed get the union it deserves.
Well, if we start from the presumption that all workers deserve a union, that individuals can't negotiate separately with a big company, unless you're a star quarterback or an international soccer player with unequaled skills, then individuals aren't going to be able to negotiate. I think that if Amazon, and I've talked to Amazon workers and I read about things that take place, but if the conditions are as reported across the board in Amazon, then they're likely to have a lot of upset employees, right? So it's possible that if the workers are successful in organizing, that they'll have a very militant union. Jeff Bezos' original plan was to work people to a frazzle, have them quit and be replaced. Amazon has a very high turnover. Walmart has a very high turnover. These are built into their models. If the turnover isn't there and people organize, then we'll see. So I don't know what they deserve. I mean, I don't really care what Amazon deserves, but I do care what the workers working under the conditions as described deserve, and that's to have some sort of protection and collective representation. Hopefully that deals a little bit with things.
All right. Now, we don't have any more questions that have come in, but so I'm wondering if anybody wants to unmute themselves if they have a question. Go ahead.
Mike, this is just more of a comment, but you had talked about associational power. And it's interesting, our daughter works in a museum, in Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. And the museum workers are starting to unionize. And they don't have a lot of power or know where to go. So they're under the umbrella of the steel union, which is helping them unionize. So I just thought that's interesting.
Yeah, there are lots of historical examples of that sort of thing. So my book, The Southern Key, is about the South in the 30s and 40s. So I have one story where in Birmingham, the laundry workers at a big laundry of a couple hundred workers unionized. The company fired them all. And thousands of Birmingham steel workers and coal worker miners showed up to join the picket lines and forced the company not only to rehire all the workers, but to recognize their union. So that's what I would call associational power. The workers themselves didn't have a lot of leverage, just like the workers at the museum that you mentioned. But if they can get the support from other layers of the working population and unions, then they have more leverage. So I think that's a good example of what we're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
So any other questions? Doesn't look like it. So then we're 4 minutes before 2:30. So that's pretty good. Carol, I'll turn it over to you.
I do have a comment. Mike, I believe, you've talked a couple times about the vertical factories being vertical instead of horizontal. Isn't it a fact that the reason they were vertical was because many of the machines were run by fan belts?
That's the origin of it. I'm chiming in on this because I know about that story. And actually it was because the original factories ran with steam machines, a steam engine with a spindle that went up many floors, and they could use that spindle on many floors to get the work done. And it took like 40 years for people to recognize, now that we have electricity, we don't have to centralize it, we can distribute it. And therefore it's much easier to have a plant on one floor where you're not going up and down stairs and all that kind of stuff. So sorry, I just chimed in on that.
Yeah, so I think so it's interesting. All the old factories were multiple stories. So I worked for International Harvester, and the original plants in Chicago were multiple stories. And when they built the new plants, like after World War II, we're talking about huge one-story things. So I think that's a general trend across industry, probably for the reasons that Carol mentioned. And once you need more land and the city's taken up, it's simpler to go to some place and what they call greenfield construction, to get a big piece of land that's nobody else wants or needs or whatever.
Okay, well, I think our time is up. We have just 2 minutes, but this is fine. If there's no more questions, Helen, in the chat?
Nope. Oh, wait, no, there aren't.
Okay, well, Dr. Goldfield, thank you so much. This was wonderful. And we wish you well in your position there in Seattle. And maybe we will see you in Holland in another year or two, and you can come and visit us.
Right. So I'm happy to be here, at least on Zoom, but it's always nicer to see people's real faces and to have back and forth conversations.
Yes. Yeah.
So I look forward to that sort of thing.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much. It was great.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you, Dr. Goldfield.
Yep. Thank you.